I kind of want to just have this conversation and shift it in towards a cultural paradigm. But before we get that, it would be just important to get a sense of what people in the room think what culture is, so that we can have a conversation where we all know where we're coming from. So when you hear, the term culture, what does that mean to you? Is it the Tanzanian flag? Is it, the clothes that we wear, the textiles, the African prints?
No.
Is it the books that we like, the music that we listen to? Is it the beads that come from the different cultural groups and regions?
I'm sorry to dominate this. It's part of it, but
yeah.
I think because we lost the essence of who we are, we now live our culture through the physical, the more visible.
Sure.
The beats, the food, the dance, but the core of who we were culturally, like the psychosocial parts, Ubuntu, the togetherness, the how collectively as a village you would have approached death, Krista, how women would have come together to say, we are the tillers of the land, so how do we come together to make sure our products work with the next? So those things we have lost because that's what colonialism attacked. So what we've been left with really, I call it it's the carcass, which is your dance, your food, the things you talk about.
Yeah, so part of why I'm asking this question is for us to get to that understanding, where we're all clear in the room that everything else, the dance, the music, the songs, the physical regalia of like specific clothes, those things are manifestations of a cultural instinct. Culture is an ethic, it is a, some people like, your Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral's, these political philosophers in this continent would call these things, they would say it's a dynamic synthesis. It's really just the struggle of how to be human and who has the right to be human, right? That's what culture is, I'm coming from a cultural space that actually takes seriously the importance of thinking culturally through the political economy, So if we're going to talk about debt, it's important to talk about how debt itself is culturally constructed. If we're going to talk about development, Debt and Development Academy, development itself is a cultural construct. But more importantly, what we were talking about like 2 weeks back is that it's a political struggle. It has to be waged in very different ways. And if that is also a political struggle, it means that that struggle itself has to be culturally weighed. And I'm going back, to an earlier point where I was saying that people like Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral, who were the revolutionaries of this continent and this black world that we live in, argued that the liberation struggle, the fight for independence, is a cultural act. It is people trying to be humans, people trying to assert that actually we are human beings and we have a right to be human beings on our own terms, in the same way that the IMF is setting terms for us of how to be humans, right? Yeah. And therefore, when we think about, the solutions to debt and our processes of development, they have to be culturally ingrained, taking into consideration our history of colonization, our history of experience today, where we come from and who we want to be. Do you know what I mean? I'm not talking about that we need to go back to the past and the solutions are in the past. Some of the solutions we are now learning can also be found in the post-independence period. Some of the articulations of the liberation movements when they became governments before things started falling apart. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from that. But for this conversation, I think part of what we're trying to do is to talk about economies are cultural constructs. Debt as a conversation within the structure of our economies is also culturally constructed. Even the legal frameworks that we use are culturally constructs. Law is a cultural construct. The dominance of specific rules over the others, the dominance of specific behaviors over the others. Those are decisions that are made by people who want a particular reading of the world and a particular material experience of the world. So it's important to really see culture at the center of how we organize even policy, how we organize, our grassroots movements, how we organize even the state itself is a cultural act, and this kind of thinking shouldn't just stay amongst, feminist groups and feminist movements who have had no choice but to understand this, simply because people are trying to understand their own domination. Why is it that being a woman, I'm experiencing gender in this way? For you to get to that point, you need to understand the behaviors, that are imputed on you, and those behaviors are cultural, So the feminist movements have had no option but to understand this, that culture is at the center of so many things. A feminist movement being one example. They're not the only groups, they're just one example for this conversation. But this has to be something that goes across our different ways of thinking, and it has to infiltrate, how we, policies are written on this continent. They shouldn't just reflect the language, the grammar of Europe, just the language and grammar of the North, of the West, in very particular ways. So for me, when we think of debt and we say that debt is culturally constructed, we have to think about what is the character of debt. Like at the basic level, what is the character of it? As people in this room who are very well and learned and experts in your field of debt, but what is the character of it in terms of how people experience it? What is the character of debt? What are its features? What does it look like? What does it feel like? It feels like hunger, and it looks like hunger. There's so many words that we could use to reframe the ways in which we think about debt and we think about borrowing. So for the conversation around culture, it's important to keep asking these questions. How do things feel? How do they look? Who do they benefit? Some of the questions that Crystal's been asking in her presentation. Who bears the brunt of it? Why do they bear the brunt of it? Because when we can answer the why, we can get back to Okanyisile's presentation around disappearance and patriarchy. Why is it that certain groups of people are affected in this particular way? That's not to say that gender and feminism is just about women, but it's about which groups of people are particularly inflamed by the violence of behaviors, And in that conversation, I think men too have a stake in feminism, because gender is a problem for all of us, It is something that, patriarchy in particular is a problem for all of us. The destruction of patriarchy is not just the liberation of women, it's a liberation of men too, it's the liberation of the human, So it's important for us to think along those lines, that the feminist struggle is also, it's everyone's struggle, even though there are certain groups of people within this feminist struggle who are affected more and in different ways. So even when we think of debt, it's important, at least for us, to have a very strong feminist lens. A feminist lens that we understand is that, like, it's about liberating the human being, beyond just the categories of women or children, because we know that once those groups of people are liberated, at least their experiences of being in the world are dealt with, that makes things easier for everyone else. It liberates everyone else, So it's important to even in the thinking around the kind of world that we want to see, the kind of relations of borrowing that we want to see on this continent. What kind of ethics do we want, around borrowing? Where can we look to? Because one of the things that we were talking about yesterday was around the different practices of borrowing, which are also culturally constructed, that we have today, that we had, even before this experience of of this particular experience of neoliberalism and this particular experience of capitalism. Today we have things like Stockfelds. I don't know what the other word is.
Chamas.
Yeah, we have all these variations of these variant ways that people in communities, specifically women, are using to to uphold their households in ways that are not going to be heavy towards each other. Obviously, they do get abused, you know. There are those situations where you have, you know, specific groups of people forming their own micro-lender groups within communities to destroy those very, like, warm structures of care that women have created, you know.
And
even
we spoke about how, I think, within this conversation, how debt is constructed within an economic system that is already both neoliberal but also patriarchal.
yes,
And so debt mechanisms must then be patriarchal.
very patriarchal, yeah,
That's
exactly. So even the mechanisms themselves, the solutions, it's always about who are they for, you know, what is the character, because I think culture becomes so difficult to explain, or to just keep it in your fingers when we don't ask the very simple things that, okay, why am I behaving like this? You know, who is this going to benefit? You know, how does this feel for this person? The word feel in our spaces is just not used because it's seen as a very
Non-technical.
feminine, non-technical, like, way of talking about things. But how things feel, how they look, and how people are experiencing things, those are very important, like, ways of thinking that can help in ushering solutions that are very, like, solutions around debt that are also very culturally, like, ingrained, you know, thinking about what kind of culture do we want to create in the alternatives that we are pushing for.
And yesterday, when we were thinking about examples, Nambusa, you told me about how apartheid created a social democracy just for a white minority. And you spoke about almost interest-free loans for farmers, for white farmers, that were subsidized by black labor.
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, like, this is information that is not even spoken about, that the apartheid state had interest-free loans. They created a socialist state for white farmers in the 40s and 50s, you know, where they had their own agricultural banks that were set up to incentivize the production, you know, where South Africa was a self-sufficient food producer, 100% self-sufficient, you know, where our farmers had protections from, you know, the external global forces. Our borders, our trade borders were very tightly closed to protect white farmers, you know, who did everything on the you know, the backs of black migrant workers from Southern Africa, not just South Africa alone. And these agricultural farmers were given land. They were given such a huge, luxurious, like, you know, credit base where they could just literally just produce and produce and produce to the point that they could accumulate profits and accumulate wealth, the wealth that they, you know, the generations are now, like, living off, and generations to come will live off. But this was a cultural decision that the Afrikaners took because they wanted to build their own base. They felt that as a cultural group, they were not as developed as, let's say, the Anglo and the British were at the time. You know, it was part of the process of accumulation. But they took very specific decisions which were culturally ingrained in their own communities to protect their own farmers. And what does the ANC, the African National Congress, do when they come into power in '94? They remove all those protections that black farmers would have needed. You know, they destroy those banks, they destroy all those mechanisms, all of those, like, ways of, those safe ways of borrowing that were created for white farmers. They completely, you know, pulled the carpet on all farmers, but the ones who would be most affected because they don't have that structure, that infrastructure to organize the agriculture, it was the black farmers, you know. So we even see at the level of the states that when the neoliberal, like, machinery rather started taking over in South Africa in the 60s, 70s, through law, through politics, you know, in the economy, in advertising, across all these different areas that make up society, we see that even our own governments takes on specific cultures which are very neoliberal. You know, neoliberalism, when we talk about it, it has its own cultural like character. It's very individualistic. It's very like islands based, that each group must stick to their own. You must work hard. The harder you work, you know, you will receive the outcomes, which is not true. That's what the universities push, for instance. You know, there are these very specific cultural behaviors or ideas that each system produces, you know. So even our own solutions have to have like cultural imperatives and objectives, that these are the things that we want to achieve. These are our aims culturally. These are our aims. These are our objectives in terms of what we want to get out of this culturally. Not just think in economic terms alone, in terms of like people's relationship to wage labor, for instance, you know, people's like relationship, you know, to like welfare state services, for instance. But what kind of society do we want to create? How must people feel in these alternatives that we're creating? How do they want to experience them, you know? Because the thing is, this thing has to be won politically, we have to be able to answer those questions. If we want people to understand what we're saying and to politically build on the knowledge production that comes from spaces like this, we have to be able to meet them at the level of experience, at the level at which their own issues are felt and experienced. And that's where the cultural work for me is very important, you know, because you can then explain to people in ways that they can understand. Because there's just no way that this struggle is going to be won outside of the political arena. You know, there's no amount of lobbying outside of the political space that can happen that will ever like allow us to reach the point at which we get to the sort of liberation that we want to achieve in this continent, you know. And the thing is, the other side, they understand that, you know, they understand that. They are very, very, you know, very clued up in terms of how to culturally dominate this continent, you know, how to culturally dominate the youth, you know. AI and all of these technologies, they already are so ahead in terms of understanding the ways in which these technologies, the ways in which young people today in a continent that has the biggest growing population of young people, how to manipulate them visually and aesthetically, you know. And they understand that the cultural imperative that this continent has to be won, continuously won through a cultural domination first. Everything else will be a manifestation of that. And what they've made us do is just to fixate only on the material production, you know. And part of our work is to make sure that our solutions respond to the cultural domination. Because without that response, it becomes very difficult to win the political struggle. And without winning the political struggle, the material and economic changes are not going to arrive in the ways that they should for people. Yeah.
So Nambuso, yesterday we also spoke about, Nambuso is a lawyer by training, and spoke about customary law and the role of women and the subjugation of women throughout the cycle of life. And so from socially reproducing life, communities, economies, and in our instance, socially reproducing capitalism, having children, in a space that isn't supported by the state, that's left you to the hands of privatization, being able to educate those children, take care of them, make sure that they're loved, to make sure that they're, you know, adults that are ethical, that are gracefully going through the world, that do the right thing, right through to burials, and who has a burden of washing bodies, feeding people, and all those funerals. We had a comparison of death insurance in Southern Africa versus in East Africa, where I come from. We come together in what we call harambees, where we, you know, give money. And these are all shows of resistance to a system, but at the same time, it is women that are carrying this burden, linked to conversations of debt, household debt that links to a sovereign debt state of our states. But at the household level, it's women who carry all the gaps that are left in this, you know, this widening gap of what's happening economically.
And some of that production, that social production, part of why it's social production is that it's invisible. You know, we don't know how to account for that debt, you know, and we don't have a language of how to account for it.
Yeah.
You know.
And we spoke about how it's an unending workforce of women that continuously, in an invisible manner, continue to hold up economies, societies, communities. But like you say, we don't have the language, we don't have the articulation or the calculation for it, you know, to push back, especially in a system that is so patriarchal and neoliberal. But there are signs of resistance. I don't call it resilience because that's a problematic term, but there are signs of resistance, and you have some music, I think, that shows this.
So what I want to do now is to share some sound with you. I initially said that I'm a cultural worker, which means that I also work with sound. Sound not just being music alone. Music is a part of the production of sound. But I use sound to understand our political history, to understand, you know, this continent and the diaspora's political economy, because there's so much in our sonic traditions that tells us about where we are, how we got here, and what the future potentiality looks like. So what I wanted to do is to share like a short sound piece. It's about, well, 7-8 minutes of 4 different groups. One is a group called the Ngogo Cultural Ensemble, which is an ensemble of cultural workers from the Eastern Cape, women. It's a women-led cultural group of mostly vocalists, and some of them play a particular type of bow instrument that is found in the Eastern Cape, but bow instruments are all over Southern Africa, and you even find them in Brazil. And then right next to that, I want to play, it's just one long thing together that's been edited together. The other person is Bavigile Ngema, who plays a song that she titles Umakweyane. Umakweyane is a very specific bow instrument that's played by women, mostly women, and most bow instruments are actually built and played by women. And Umakweyane is played by mostly women in Nguni cultures. Specifically, the Zulu people will call it Umakweyane, but you'll find other words for it. And the reason why I bring in Ubavigile in this conversation is that she's doing what I'm trying to talk about here. You know, Umakweyane is an instrument that is played by women and it's built by them. And a lot of the traditions of Umakweyane are about the things that the invisible struggles that women encounter in their everyday domestic social production of the home, social production and economic production of the community that they can't talk about. And a lot of those songs and a lot of those issues end up making their ways in the sonic space, you know, where they can sing about these things, but they can't talk about them in the communal space. You know, they can sing about their fields, they can sing about their children, they can sing about, you know, the invasion of like the Afrikaner whites in South Africa at a particular time. You know, they sing a lot of resistance songs that you will never hear. The conversations, you'll never hear them come out in their everyday conversation. So Umakweyane becomes a space for a lot of women to articulate the issues of social production that are not taken seriously. The fact that they're also economic producers in ways that are not taken seriously. A lot of those conversations and a lot of the feminist historians have had to go into that music to really understand, you know, what do these women think in South Africa, in Southern Africa in particular, around economic production, around social production, around the home. You know, as farmers, what are their views, you know, on the conditions that they work under. All of those things can be found in the music. And then the other 2 groups are two women's groups of farmers, one from Sudan. It's an agricultural group in Sudan, and the other is an agricultural group in Ghana, you know, where a lot of this music actually comes out of their work as farmers. This is not specific to these countries. You find it even in Tanzania, where there are certain sounds and music, you know, we'll call it like labor union music that comes out of the process of people working, you know, where they're able to recreate themselves in the process of being workers. They have to reinvent who they are in spite of the situations that they find themselves in, you know. And part of why I'm doing this is to just push the point again that cultural practice is in everything, you know. People are always asserting their own ways of how they want to be human in the work that they do, you know. So even in the work of doing policy, you know, there has to be an understanding of what, you know, it is to be human and what it is that people are actually fighting for at the very core, you know. Yes, it's about bread and butter, but it's also about a restoration of a particular type of dignity, you know, that has been lost for the last 500, 400 years. And that kind of stuff has to be reflected in the technical work that we do, you know. So the sonics piece is just an example of how, you know, policy work and sonic work and sound work and artistic cultural work can sit right next to each other. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Even the domination of, you know, the creation of these silos, that the arts are there, the technical work is here, is actually a production of a capitalist system. It's a production of individualism, that, okay, they must work in silos. But when you look at the capitalist system, it is not siloed. The advertising is speaking to the economy, to the policy work, you know, what you see on TV in the films is reflecting and is signifying exactly how, you know, cities are set up. It's amplifying how architecture, you know, the architects are doing their work. You know, in the neoliberal system, the West in particular, when I say the West, I'm talking about, you know, the people who are interested and are vested in the groups of people who have deep interest in those systems. The machinery that capacitates that system is so invested in understanding the cultural and artistic world that they dominate with it. From the TV adverts that we see, the sort of shows that we see, you know, the cartoons, the music that we listen to, you know, everything, the architecture, the buildings that we choose, you know, what we think is clean, what we think is order, you know, all of those things are so ingrained in our minds, because this other side has understood that, you know, when they make even, you know, presenting the new solutions to Africa. Those solutions, they are widespread. They will be in the policy rooms for sure. They will be in parliaments. They will be, you know, in the bigger technical spaces. But they will infiltrate, you know, they will infiltrate the mainstream spaces. They will infiltrate media. They will infiltrate social media, you know. You will find them layered in fashion. You'll find them layered in the visual arts. You know, it's everywhere. So it's very important to actually study and understand the cultural realm. Even as lawyers, you know, I come from a legal background, but I understood that I had to understand culture as a dominating, as a superstructure in itself, in as much as law is a superstructure, to really understand how power organizes through the law, you know. One comment and then we can play the...
I think for me, what I'm taking from what you both and Crystal have shared is something we are taught first year in political science, that there's a dominant discourse and there's a marginalized discourse. And everything you've just said says that the dominant, that's why they colonized in the first place. And that's why we thought they left with Ghana 1957. They already knew they have neocolonialism in place. So the dominant discourse will not go. And to uphold it, as you say, they have every facet of life controlled, working for the center. So yeah, I think I just want to commend the approach for you and Crystal. And then there's also, I'll try and get the name. There are two Japanese books I used when I wrote my book, Crystal, where they argue that we were taught, I think Nombuso just said it, we were taught that development depends on the economy. And they are arguing, no, development depends on a cultural revolution. So Europe had the Renaissance, which actually is a cultural revolution coming from the Dark Ages. And they emerged from there to colonize the world. China had one, look at where they are. Japan had one. It doesn't matter which society you look at. America had its own. Every society that went on to develop has had a cultural revolution. In Africa, we are taught that culture is a backward thing, dump it, it does not work, focus on the economy.
Exactly. And even the this conversation can go on forever. But even the point you made around, you know, these different groups of people dominating and taking the artifacts of the people that they dominate, and they create altars around that. You find it even in South Africa. There are monuments everywhere. There are monuments all over this continent, and when we talk about them, we'll think of them as, oh, they're just monuments.
No.
They're just celebrations of a particular person. But that language is very like, it's like it just creates this thin veil where we don't actually get to the reality of it and think, oh, these are actual altars. You know, these are altars that were created by these people who understand what cultural domination is, and who also have an understanding of spirituality in ways that we don't think they do, because they've created the impression that they don't. You know, that, you know, all of these things are pagan. You know, understanding of a cult of a spiritual realm is very like illogical behavior. You know, it's very like, it's very pagan. It's very irrational. It's very there's another word. English is just yes, heathen, very heathen. It's very
backward.
It's very backwards,
Uncivilized.
you know, uncivilized,
primitive,
exactly, right? But yet those are the same technologies, ancient technologies that they are using, you know, to fortify their domination over people. You know, you have the monuments like the Fort Trekker in South Africa, you know, where people just think it's just a monument to memorialize a particular experience of, you know, the Afrikaners. But it's actually an altar, you know. There are altars all over this continent which are culturally constructed to submerge and just to fortify the dominance of these people, you know, of these groups, the dominance of their own cultural ideas like capitalism. Capitalism is a cultural construct. You know, it's a set of behaviors that manifest themselves through the economy, that manifest themselves through artistic production. It manifests themselves in so many different ways. You know, it's not just, you know, what is your relationship to wage labor? How much are you earning and how much are you not? What is wealth? How much wealth are you, like, do you have? You know, what is your proximity to income, like, growth? It's not just those things, you know, but it's the behaviors and a lot of these things that we can't always have the words and language for. We can find them in the sonic space.
Toolkit, and a feminist tactic or strategy is using imagination, and imagination as a political tool. This idea that we have to let go of the shackles of this space that we occupy in our current formulation of economy, of states, and imagine what life we'd like to live, how we'd like to organize. But that also means suspending some of our assumptions. And so I'll ask you and invite you to have a bucket in your brain, or let's put them all in that white tent in our minds, of things that you carry as assumptions, to suspend them there, to imagine for now. So assumptions like economic growth is important if we're going to have everybody able to access things, or education is the pillar of development, education in a, you know, a capitalist sense, or you know, women have to take care of children, or you know what, I'll go around. Dawn, you look like you have a smile and you're thinking of something. What would you like to put in that tent?
That infrastructure is very necessary.
Okay, so put that there. Anybody else? Kanisila?
Debt is inevitable.
Debt is inevitable.
There's something you talked about, you know, the import, the export, and just reflecting, you know, and what our leaders and what yourselves do in our own communities. And she spoke about it, how South Africa at some point was feeding itself. The farmers were able to produce enough. But why is it that we are able to produce enough flowers
Yeah.
Why is it that we're able to produce enough coffee, enough tea,
Vegetables for export.
To producing what we can't consume, and consuming what we don't produce. So just thinking about how, especially when we gained independence, the structural traps that were laid against us so that we're not able to feed ourselves, yet we were already feeding ourselves, and how to deal with those structural traps, because those are the traps that actually put us into debt.
Yeah. And remembering that.
We're encouraged to grow our tourism so that they can come and give us the forex we need to import the food that we need to consume. And if we don't have enough of that, then we borrow to be able to import. So
And remembering that in that immediate post-independence period, Africa was 93% food sovereign. But now Kenya imports over 70% of our wheat. And wheat is something that we also culturally wasn't our staple then.
Exactly.
So who decided that this is the food that we're eating?
Linking to culture.
Yeah.
So just to add to what Job is saying, while we are told we are not producing enough, who made the decision though, Job, that the first grade and second grade agricultural produce is for Europe?
Yeah.
You know, the English people still eat better fruit than they want to eat in South Africa. They keep the third grade and fourth grade for local consumption in almost all our countries. I don't know if people are aware.
Yeah.
The first and second grade is always for external, and Europe primarily.
Yeah. I'm going to put Ishmael on the spot because this area of the room is quiet. Anything you'd like to put in the tent? That Africa is poor. Anybody? Yeah.
Development is a collective effort.
Wow. Okay. Development is a collective effort. Interesting. We'll put it in the tent as a suspension. Wow. Okay. All right. So if you go into here, and we'll put you in groups of 3, just like 3 or 4, whoever's around you. And if you turn the page to economy.
Page 23.
Page 23. How did you know it's 23? Oh, right. Yeah, there are pages. So be as wild as you possibly can. Like, you don't have the World Bank, you don't have the IMF, you don't have thinking about the economy in the way that you do and that you've been taught. But go back to yourselves, and then you can answer the questions. The first one is, imagine you're in a village, right? So you've constructed the village of MSTDC. Oh no, that Danish, let's not do that. Your village, wherever. Going back to also what Kanisile says, so the first question is, how is value defined? Who decides what's valuable or not, and how do you prioritize that? What does your currency look like? I've had groups who say they do away with money because everything is provided, so what would you need money for? The state provides healthcare, food, collectively, so what would you actually need to exchange money for? So define for yourselves. How do we regulate our local economy to share and sustain resources, support people, and live within our means? So you can start off with those 3. There are other questions on the facing page that you can take home, and you can take this home and go through different elements from power to home to resources. And it's really an interesting way to just, use imagination as a tool to think about what you really want this world, this continent to look like, beyond what we're told in the policy spaces that we occupy, that we have to operate in a certain way, speak in a certain language, dress in a certain way. So this is you really just let go of all of that. So we'll give you about half an hour to just, and then we'll come back. So in groups of like 3 or 4, just around you, you can go through the first 3, and then we'll come back. What was interesting? What did you come up with that was really radically different? And also, remember, keep in mind that everything is a construct. The way capitalism was formed was a bunch of men, the Chicago boys, that decided this is how we're going to run economies. And so in the same vein, we had a conversation of like, are we building a utopian vision? But what is utopian if everything is a construct? And you can completely deconstruct and reconstruct, really, if you think about it. If you think about COVID, airports shut down globally. This was something that nobody thought would ever happen, but it did. So anything interesting, weird, a little scary that came up in your conversations? please feel free to go through it by yourself. There's different sections, like I said. There's one on power, body, all sorts
Labor.
of things. Yeah, labor. Just to like question yourselves and our assumptions in this world that we occupy. Who is it set by? Why is it set this way? And how can we disrupt to make it better? And I guess for the next 3 days that we're here together, to have that audacity to be able to disrupt it and to re-articulate it and to reclaim it for ourselves, to center both our people and our planet.
And culture.
And culture. Yeah. Thank you.